The power went out at 11:47 p.m., and that was how Micah ended up in Dante's doorway with a candle shaking in his hand. "Don't panic," Dante said, though his own voice cracked on the second word. "It's probably just the block." "I'm not panicking." Micah was absolutely panicking, and not because of the dark. They had been roommates for exactly 6 weeks. Two strangers who'd matched on an apartment listing app because neither of them could afford the city alone, and who had spent those 6 weeks tiptoeing around each other with the careful politeness of people who didn't yet know if they'd become friends or just two men who shared a refrigerator. Micah knew Dante took his coffee black and hummed off-key when he cooked. Dante knew Micah left the hallway light on because he liked reading in the dark of his own room, lit only by that one gold seam under the door. Small things. Roommate things. Neither of them knew yet what the space between their two bodies would feel like collapsing to nothing. It happened because the candle guttered. A draft from the cracked window, or maybe just bad luck, and the little flame bent sideways and died, and in the sudden black Micah stepped forward without thinking. Toward where he remembered the wall being, toward safety, and found instead the warm solid line of Dante's chest. "Sorry," Dante started. Micah started. Their faces were close enough that Micah could feel the shape of Dante's breath change. Could feel, more than see, the exact moment Dante went still in the way people go still when they're deciding something. Micah's hand had landed flat against Dante's sternum, and he could feel Dante's heart slamming against his palm like it was trying to get out. Neither of them moved back. "Micah." Dante's voice had dropped to something Micah had never heard from him before. Low, unsteady, almost reverent. "If the power doesn't come back on in the next 5 seconds, I'm going to do something I can't take back." Micah's whole body had gone electric. Somewhere in the dark, his mouth had already decided. His mind was still catching up. For seconds, he whispered. The lights snapped back on. They flew apart like they'd been caught doing something illegal. Dante against the doorframe, Micah halfway across the room, both of them breathing like they'd run somewhere instead of standing perfectly still. The overhead bulb buzzed to life, flooding the hallway in ordinary yellow light, and for a moment they just stared at each other, chests heaving, 12 inches suddenly feeling like the widest distance in the world. That was... Dante rubbed the back of his neck, refusing to meet Micah's eyes. That was the power. That's all that was. "Right," Micah said, though his heart hadn't gotten the memo. The power. They said goodnight like nothing had happened. Micah lay awake until 3 a.m. with his palm pressed against his own chest, trying to remember what Dante's heartbeat had felt like, trying to convince himself he'd imagined the way Dante had leaned in. Just barely, just enough, before the lights came back. He hadn't imagined it. He knew that the way you know your own name. 3 weeks earlier, Dante had knocked on Micah's door holding a mug of coffee he hadn't been asked to make, and said, "You looked like you needed this." And that had been the first time Micah's chest had done something strange and unfamiliar. A small, warm lurch, like missing a step on a staircase. He'd told himself it was nothing. Just kindness. Just two guys being decent roommates. But kindness didn't usually make him replay a sentence for 4 days. Micah had grown up in a house where feelings were filed and labeled and kept tidy, where his father's disapproval lived just beneath the surface of every conversation like a current under still water. He'd learned early to keep the parts of himself that felt dangerous folded up small, tucked somewhere no one would go looking. He was 24 years old, and he had never once let himself want someone out loud. Dante was different. Had been different since the day he'd shown up to view the apartment wearing a paint-splattered jacket and an easy, unguarded smile and said, "I hope you don't mind, I talk to my plants," like it was the most natural confession in the world. He said what he meant. He hummed off-key on purpose, he told Micah once, because life's too short to be embarrassed about the small stuff. He had a laugh that filled a room and a habit of remembering things. Micah's favorite tea, the name of his childhood dog, the fact that Tuesdays were hard for reasons Micah never fully explained. Somewhere in 6 weeks of shared silence and shared meals, Micah had stopped being able to tell the difference between I like having a roommate and I like him. The morning after the blackout, they moved around the kitchen like two magnets with the same pole facing each other. Close, but pushed apart by some invisible resistance. Dante made 2 coffees out of habit and then stood holding both mugs, unsure suddenly which one was Micah's. "Left is mine," Micah said quietly. Right. Dante handed it over. Their fingers brushed on the exchange, and something crossed his face. Quick, unguarded, gone before Micah could name it. About last night. You don't have to. I want to, Dante said, and that stopped Micah cold because Dante rarely interrupted anyone. I've been lying to both of us for 3 weeks, and I'm tired of it. Micah's pulse climbed into his throat. Lying about what? Dante set his mug down like he needed his hands free for whatever came next, and then seemed to lose his nerve entirely, laughing under his breath at himself. Nothing. Forget it. I'll be late for work. He left without finishing his coffee. Micah stood in the kitchen for a long time after the door clicked shut, holding the ghost of an almost confession in his hands like something too fragile to put down. That was how it went, for a while, a slow, unbearable orbit. They didn't talk about the blackout, but everything after it was different, charged in a way neither of them acknowledged out loud. Dante started leaving the hallway light on even when Micah forgot. Micah started making 2 coffees before Dante was even awake. They watched movies on the couch, sitting a careful, deliberate foot apart, and Micah spent entire 90-minute films aware of nothing but the warmth radiating off Dante's arm. Then Eli happened. Eli was Dante's coworker, tall, easy laughing, the kind of confident that made rooms rearrange themselves around him, and he started showing up. Coffee on his way to work. Movie night since Dante mentioned you guys were watching something. A hand on Dante's shoulder that lingered a half-second too long. A familiarity that made something ugly and unfamiliar twist behind Micah's ribs. He told himself it wasn't jealousy. He told himself that for 4 days, right up until the night Eli left and Dante turned to him, grinning, saying he's a good guy, right? And Micah heard himself say, flatly, sure, in a voice so cold it surprised them both. Dante's smile faltered. What's wrong? Nothing. Micah was already retreating to his room. I'm tired. Micah. Dante caught his wrist in the hallway. The same hallway, Micah couldn't help but notice, where the candle had died weeks ago. Talk to me. There's nothing to talk about. But his voice betrayed him, thin and tight, and Dante's eyes searched his face with an intensity that made Micah's carefully filed feelings threaten to spill out of every seam. Micah swallowed. I don't know what we're doing, Dante. I don't know what this is. And I can't watch you smile at someone else like that and pretend I don't feel like the floor's been pulled out from under me. So maybe you should just tell me what you almost said 3 weeks ago, or maybe you should let go of my wrist because I can't keep doing whatever this is. The silence that followed felt like standing at the edge of something. I was gonna say, Dante said slowly, each word deliberate, like he was setting down something heavy and precious, that I haven't stopped thinking about you since the day I moved in. That I make 2 coffees because some stupid, hopeful part of me likes pretending we start every morning together on purpose. That Eli means nothing, and I only let him keep coming around because I was a coward, because it felt safer than telling you the truth and losing you completely if you didn't feel it too. Micah couldn't breathe. I've been scared, Dante went on, quieter now, his hand sliding from Micah's wrist to lace loosely, carefully, with his fingers, like he was asking permission with every centimeter. That if I said it out loud, I'd ruin the only good thing I have right now. But I'd rather you know and walk away than keep pretending I don't want you the way I do. Dante. Micah's voice broke on the name. You don't have to say anything. I've wanted you to kiss me since the blackout, Micah said, the words tumbling out before he could file them away, before he could fold them small and safe. I've wanted it every single day since, and I hated Eli for no reason except that he got to stand near you without falling apart, and I'm done being scared too. For a moment neither of them moved, 12 inches of hallway between them feeling, again like the widest and narrowest distance in the world all at once. Then Dante closed it. The kiss was soft first. Testing, disbelieving, like neither of them trusted the moment to be real. And then it wasn't soft anymore. It was 6 weeks of careful distance collapsing all at once. Dante's hand cradling the back of Micah's neck. Micah's fingers fisting in the front of Dante's shirt like he was afraid the floor might disappear again. When they finally broke apart, foreheads resting together, both of them breathless, Dante laughed. A shaky, disbelieving sound. I've been rehearsing that for 3 weeks, he admitted. It was supposed to be smoother. It was perfect, Micah said, and meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Not exactly. There were still hard conversations ahead. Still Micah's father's voice to quiet in the back of his mind. Still the strange, vulnerable work of learning how to be wanted instead of hidden. But that night, standing in the hallway where a candle had once died and everything had changed, Micah let himself believe, for the first time, that some things were worth being unafraid for. Dante pressed one more kiss to his temple, soft and certain. For the record, he murmured, "I'm really glad the power went out." Micah laughed, really laughed, the kind that came from somewhere he'd kept locked for years, and pulled him back in. "Don't get used to it," he said. "Next time, I'm turning the lights off myself." Micah's phone buzzed at 8:02 a.m., 3 days after the kiss in the hallway, and the name on the screen made his stomach drop straight through the floor. He stared at it until it stopped ringing, and then it started again, immediately, the way his father only ever called when he already knew something and wanted to hear you lie about it first. "Who is it?" Dante asked from the stove, spatula in hand, still wearing the soft, unguarded happiness that had lived on his face for 3 straight days. "Nobody," Micah said, and hated himself for it, because Dante's smile flickered. Just slightly, just enough to notice. Like some old instinct had already flagged the word as a warning. He answered on the 4th ring. "Hey, Dad, your cousin Priya saw a photo." His father's voice was flat, controlled, the same tone he'd used Micah's whole childhood right before a conversation became a verdict. "You and some man, at a restaurant, holding hands like a pause, sharp as a blade. Is there something you want to tell me?" Micah's whole body went cold. He hadn't even remembered anyone taking a photo, just remembered Dante reaching across the table 2 nights ago, lacing their fingers together in public for the first time, grinning like he'd been waiting his whole life to do something that ordinary. Micah had let him, had wanted the whole world to see, for once instead of hiding. Now the world had seen, and it had gotten back to the one person he'd spent his whole life trying to stay small enough to not disappoint. "Dad, I raised you better than this." His father's voice cracked, not with sadness, with something colder. "I won't have people asking me about my son and some—" "Don't," Micah said, and his own voice shook, but it didn't break. "Don't finish that sentence." Silence stretched down the line, thick and dangerous. "If this is true," his father said finally, "don't bother coming home for Christmas. I mean it, Micah. I won't sit across from that at my table." The call ended. Micah stood frozen in the kitchen with the phone still pressed to his ear, listening to a dial tone that felt louder than anything his father had actually said. "Micah." Dante's voice, gentle, close. He turned the stove off without Micah noticing. "Hey, look at me." Micah lowered the phone. His hands were shaking. "He knows." Dante didn't ask how, didn't ask what was said. Just crossed the kitchen and pulled Micah into his chest, one hand cradling the back of his head, and held on like he could absorb the shock through sheer proximity. "I'm here," he murmured into Micah's hair. "Whatever happens, I'm here." Micah wanted to believe that would be enough. For 3 days it had felt like it might be. He didn't tell Dante the rest, that his father had once, years ago, caught him staring a beat too long at a boy from his swim team and never let him forget it. That Christmas at that table had always come with the silent condition of being exactly who his father needed him to be. He didn't tell him because saying it out loud made it real, and Micah had spent 24 years being very good at not making things real. But Dante noticed anyway. Dante always noticed. "You've been somewhere else all week," he said one evening, sitting cross-legged on the couch, watching Micah stare at the same page of a book he hadn't turned in 20 minutes. "Talk to me, please. I'm fine. You keep saying that like it's true just because you say it enough times." Dante's voice wasn't angry. It was worse than angry. It was hurt, quiet and careful. "I told you everything, Micah. In that hallway, I gave you every scared, ugly, hopeful thing I had. And you've been giving me, 'I'm fine' for a week." Micah closed the book. "What do you want me to say? The truth. Even if it's messy. Especially if it's messy." Dante shifted closer, closing the distance that had crept back between them. That same old resistance Micah had thought they'd broken for good. "I'm not your father, Micah. You don't have to earn the right to be honest with me." Something in Micah's chest gave way, not all at once, but like a seam finally tearing after being pulled too tight for too long. He said not to come home for Christmas. He said he won't sit at his table with, his voice cracked, with what you and I are. And I keep telling myself it doesn't matter, that I don't need him. But I'm 24 years old and I still want my father to be proud of me. And I hate that. I hate that some part of me still wants his approval more than I want to be happy. Dante didn't say anything right away. He just reached over, took Micah's hand. The same hand he'd held across that restaurant table, the hand that had started all of this, and held it like something worth keeping. You're allowed to grieve that, Dante said finally. Wanting him to be proud of you doesn't make you weak, and it doesn't mean you have to shrink yourself to get it. Those are two different things, and I don't ever want you to think loving me means choosing to lose everything else. What if I do, though? Micah's voice was barely a whisper. Lose everything else? Then you'll still have me. Dante lifted Micah's hand and pressed a kiss to his knuckles. Slow and deliberate. For whatever that's worth. It's worth a lot, Micah said. It's worth more than I know how to say. The thing about Eli, the thing Micah hadn't let himself think about since the hallway, was that he didn't disappear just because Dante had chosen someone else. He showed up at Dante's work more, not less. He started texting things that towed a careful, deniable line. Miss hanging out, just the two of us. And Dante, easy and trusting by nature, hadn't thought much of it until the night Eli showed up at their apartment uninvited, holding a bottle of wine and an expression that made Micah's skin prickle with old, unnamed instinct. I was in the neighborhood, Eli said. Too smooth, too rehearsed. Dante's not here, Micah said, standing in the doorway, not moving to let him in. I know. Eli's smile didn't waver. I was hoping to talk to you, actually. Micah's stomach tightened. About how you're not who he needs. Eli said it lightly, conversationally, like he was commenting on the weather. Dante's easy. Open. He falls fast and hard. And you? His eyes swept over Micah with something close to contempt. You're gonna spend the next year making him feel guilty for existing too loudly. Just like you're doing to yourself right now. I've watched you shrink every time your phone rings. He deserves someone who isn't scared of his own life. The words landed harder than Micah wanted to admit, because some small, wounded part of him agreed. Get out, Micah said, and was surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. Just think about it, Eli said, already turning to go, infuriatingly unbothered. I'll be here when you finally believe me. Micah shut the door and stood in the hallway for a long time, Eli's words looping in his chest like something poisonous. You're going to spend the next year making him feel guilty for existing too loudly. He thought of his father's voice on the phone. He thought of Dante's easy, unguarded happiness and wondered, with a fear sharper than anything Eli had said out loud, whether loving him meant slowly teaching him to be smaller too. When Dante came home that night, Micah didn't mention Eli's visit. He told himself it was to avoid drama. The truth was uglier. Some small, frightened part of him was starting to believe Eli might be right. It came apart 3 nights later, the way things that are quietly rotting always eventually do. Dante mentioned, casually over dinner, that Eli had invited him to a work thing. Just drinks, nothing big. And Micah's silence stretched a beat too long, his face doing something he couldn't quite control. What? Dante asked. Nothing. Micah. Dante set his fork down, weary in a way Micah hadn't heard from him before. We agreed. No more nothing. So Micah told him. About the visit, the wine, the words that had lodged themselves under his skin like splinters. Dante's face went through something complicated. Surprise, then anger, though not at Micah. He came here, while I wasn't home. Dante's jaw tightened, and said what to you? That I'm going to make you smaller. That you deserve someone who isn't scared. Micah's voice thinned. And the worst part is, some nights I think he's right. Micah, look at me. Dante reached across the table, cupped Micah's jaw, forced their eyes to meet. I have never once felt smaller with you. I feel more myself with you than I have with anyone. You are not your father's fear. And you're not whatever poison Eli's selling because he can't stand that I chose you. His thumb brushed Micah's cheekbone, gentle, insistent. I need you to hear me. You are not something I need protecting from. You're the first person who's ever made me feel like all of me was safe. Micah's eyes stung. I'm sorry I didn't tell you right away. I know. Dante's voice softened further. But no more secrets, even the ones that feel like protecting me. Deal? Deal, Micah whispered. Dante kissed him then. Slow, certain, grounding. And for the first time since his father's phone call, Micah let himself believe that whatever this was between them was sturdier than the fear trying to talk him out of it. Christmas came, and Micah's father didn't call. Micah spent the day in their small apartment instead. String lights looped haphazardly around the kitchen. Dante humming off-key while he burned the first batch of cookies and laughed about it instead of apologizing for it. It wasn't the table Micah had grown up at. It was smaller, quieter, and it was, impossibly, the first Christmas in years that hadn't felt like holding his breath. Regret anything? Dante asked that night, both of them tangled together on the couch. Fairy lights the only light in the room. Micah thought of the father who wasn't there, the empty chair at a table he wasn't sitting at, the whole complicated grief of it. And then he thought of Dante's hand in his under a string of lights, of a year spent slowly learning to stop shrinking. No, Micah said, and meant it completely. Not one thing. Spring came quietly, the way real healing usually does. Not as a single dramatic thaw, but as small, unremarkable mornings that slowly stopped hurting. Micah still flinched sometimes when his phone rang with an unknown number. Dante still left the hallway light on. An old habit neither of them talked about anymore because it didn't need explaining. 6 months had passed since the blackout. 6 months since a candle had died at the wrong moment and changed everything. It was on one of those unremarkable mornings that Eli came back. He didn't show up at the apartment this time. He caught Micah alone, outside the coffee shop near Micah's office, like he'd been waiting for exactly this. A moment without Dante's steadiness standing between them. "You look good," Eli said, falling into step beside him, easy as anything. Happy even. "I'm surprised. What do you want, Eli?" Honestly, Eli's smile faded into something more tired, more human than Micah had ever seen from him. "I wanted to apologize. What I said to you, about you making him smaller, that wasn't fair. I said it because I wanted it to be true, because I've been in love with Dante since the day I met him. And watching him choose you instead nearly broke something in me." Micah stopped walking. Whatever he'd braced for, it wasn't this. "I'm not going to pretend I'm over it," Eli went on, quieter now. "But I've watched you two for 6 months, and I was wrong. He doesn't look smaller with you. He looks like himself, more than I've ever seen him. And I think some ugly part of me needed you to fail so my own feelings would make sense." He exhaled, something loosening in his shoulders. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just needed you to know I know that now. Why tell me instead of him?" "Because you're the one I hurt worst," Eli said simply. "And because I think I owe him space to actually be happy, instead of me hovering at the edges hoping it falls apart." He held out a hand, almost formal. "I'm not going to be a problem anymore. That's all I came to say." Micah shook it slowly, still off balance. "Thank you for telling me." Eli nodded once and walked away and didn't look back. And Micah stood on the sidewalk a long moment, feeling something in his chest unclench that he hadn't realized had still been tight. He told Dante that night, all of it, no editing, no protecting, the promise they'd made to each other since Christmas. Dante listened with his jaw tight, his hand tangled in Micah's the whole time, and when Micah finished, he let out a long breath. "I had no idea," Dante said, "about any of it. God, Micah. I'm sorry he made you carry that alone for so long." "I'm not telling you so you'll apologize for him," Micah said. "I'm telling you because we don't do secrets anymore, even the uncomfortable ones." Dante pulled him close, pressing a kiss to his temple, then his jaw, then finally, softly, his mouth. "I love you," he said, not for the first time, but it still landed the way it always did, like something new. "I love every version of you, including the scared one who almost didn't tell me any of this. I love you too." Micah said it easily now, the way he hadn't been able to a year ago, the words no longer feeling dangerous in his mouth. "Even the reckless one who kissed me in a hallway during a blackout. Best decision I ever made," Dante said, grinning. "Worth every second of nearly setting the curtains on fire with that candle." The last thread was the hardest one, and it took longer to resolve than either of them expected. Nearly a full year from that first blackout kiss to the letter that arrived, unannounced, in Micah's mailbox on an ordinary Tuesday in early spring. He recognized his father's handwriting before he even opened it, and his hands shook reading it at the kitchen table while Dante sat quietly beside him, close enough to be a steady presence, careful not to crowd the moment. Micah, it read, "I've had a year to think about what I said, and I'm not going to pretend I've entirely made peace with it. But your mother reminded me, more than once, that I'd rather have a son at my table who isn't who I imagined, than an empty chair where he used to sit. I don't fully understand your life. I'd like to try. If you're willing, I'd like to meet him. Your father." Micah read it 3 times before he could speak. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, and Dante's hand found his beneath the table, steady as it had always been. "It's not an apology," Micah said, voice thick. "No," Dante agreed gently. "But it's a door. That's not nothing. Will you come? If I go?" Dante brought Micah's hand to his lips, kissed his knuckles the way he had 100 times since that hallway. "Anywhere," he said. "Every time." They didn't fix everything. That first dinner at Micah's parents' table months later. His father was stiff, awkward, occasionally said the wrong thing and caught himself, apologizing in the clumsy way of a man unlearning 24 years of certainty. But he shook Dante's hand at the door, called him by his name, and didn't flinch when Dante, on instinct, reached over halfway through dinner and laced his fingers with Micah's on the table, right out in the open, the way he had that first time in the restaurant that started it all. It wasn't the fairy tale. It was better, somehow messier, harder one, and entirely real. That night, back in their apartment, the same hallway light burning gold under the door the way it always did. Micah stood in the doorway of Dante's room and thought of that first blackout. The candle, the darkness, the dangerous 4 seconds of not knowing what came next. "What are you thinking about?" Dante asked, looking up from his book. "That I used to be so scared of the dark," Micah said. "And now it's my favorite place in the world, as long as you're standing in it with me." Dante set the book aside, crossed the room, and pulled him close, forehead resting against his the way it had that very first night. "Turns out," he murmured, "the dark was never the scary part. It was just where I finally found the courage to tell you the truth. Good thing the power went out then." "Best blackout of my life," Dante agreed, and kissed him. Slow, certain home, and Micah let himself believe, fully and without fear, that this was exactly where he was supposed to be.